Hi, everyone. My name is Vanessa Smeichel, and I am the Strategic Engagement Specialist at EMH. So we are now turning to session 2, and it's titled Why Canada Needs Coordinated Electricity System Planning. So this conversation will look at why better alignment across provinces, system operators, regulators, and project developers is essential to delivering the infrastructure Canada needs on the path to net zero. So I'd like to invite the 4 panelists to join us on stage as I introduce our moderator, Kate Koplovich. So you can come up stage. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So Kate is a senior policy analyst for energy at the C.D. Howe Institute, where she works on advancing Canada's energy sector while supporting a low-carbon economy. She previously led strategy at Calgary Economic Development and worked with Deloitte on decarbonization and sustainability for major energy companies. She holds an MSc in Economics and Policy of Energy and the Environment from the University College London and a Bachelor of Environmental Studies from the University of Waterloo. So please join me in welcoming our panelists and Kate for session 2.
Thanks, Vanessa. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for the second session. The topic of coordinated electricity system planning is certainly gaining momentum as cities and provinces across Canada grapple with maintaining low-cost electricity for consumers and managing potential future increases in electricity demand, whether through electrification of vehicles or industrial processes or AI and quantum compute power needs, all while achieving emissions reductions and driving to a net zero electricity grid. And I'm sure many of you saw the mention of increased interties in the Memorandum of Understanding recently signed between the Alberta and federal governments. Canada, as a country, is blessed with myriad natural resources we can use for electricity generation: rivers, solar potential, natural gas reserves, wind, and critical minerals like uranium for nuclear power. But provinces hold constitutional jurisdiction over electricity systems, hampering the ability to coordinate across provincial boundaries. I'm so looking forward to the conversation this morning with our esteemed speakers, especially as one of them, Dr. Madeleine McPherson, recently released a C.D. Howe Institute paper called Powering the Federation, a Blueprint for National Electricity Integration in Canada, which she'll be discussing today. And yes, I had to plug her work because it's also the C.D. Howe Institute's work. I won't start off by reading each speaker's bios in full, but we'll have the same session structure as the first session, where we'll have each of the panelists come up, do a presentation, and then followed by audience Q&A. So make sure to submit your questions through the Slido, which is on the screen here, with the code, and also you can come up to the 2 mics. Now there's 2 mics to answer as many questions as possible. So without further ado, I need to get her bio out. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Madeleine McPherson, for her presentation titled Why Canada Needs Coordinated Electricity System Planning. Dr. Madeleine McPherson is an associate professor of civil engineering at the University of Victoria and leads the Sustainable Energy Systems Integration and Transitions Group. She and her team are developing tools to explore electrification and energy systems integration for decarbonization pathways. She also serves as an executive member of the Energy Modelling Hub, facilitating national dialogue on decarbonizing Canada's energy system. Please welcome Madeleine McPherson.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks for being here today. So yeah, I'm going to talk about interprovincial transmission in Canada. I'm going to start just briefly by making the case a little bit. I think that the rest of our panelists are also going to be making the case. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I'll dive a little bit into some modeling results to sort of quantify why interties across Canada really are as beneficial as we think that they are. But then I'm going to focus most of the presentation on comparison of best practices for interregional transmission around the world, and then finally end up with the blueprint for Canada, some next steps for developing more interties in Canada. So the premise here is really that transmission is a key enabler of the energy transition. And there's a number of reasons for this. So just sort of qualitatively, the first thing is it really allows us to access better renewable energy resources. So here you're looking at a map of wind speeds across Canada, and you can really see how some provinces and some regions have just much better wind regimes than other provinces. So just to put some numbers behind this, wind development in Alberta has come in between like $35 and $40 a megawatt hour in calls, while in BC it's over $90 a megawatt hour. So that's a difference in resource and also difficulty building in BC versus in Alberta. So, but of course, to be able to take advantage of this wind power in BC, we would need an intertie. That also is then connected to this really nice pairing of wind-rich regions across Canada that happen to sit next to our hydro-dominated provinces. So BC, Alberta make a really nice pair with really high-quality wind in BC and very flexible hydro high-quality wind in Alberta, very flexible hydro in BC. And we see sort of this similar pattern going across the country. So there's sort of this really nice dance partnership between these wind-hydro pairs. And also connected to that is if we have more interties, it allows us to smooth renewable energy production over larger distances. So here you're looking at a correlation coefficient between wind regimes at increasing distances going out to 2,000 kilometers, and you can see how it actually dips negative at distances greater than 1,500 kilometers. So this smoothing of variable renewable energy production just makes it easier to manage that dispatchability of wind, which then brings us to the operation of the power system. So here you're looking at a very variable wind regime on the top and a smoother wind regime on the bottom, and just what happens to a dispatch plot in both cases. So when we have that really big variability, there's fuel costs associated with peaking generators that have to come online and fill in the gap. There's more cycling of conventional power plants that is costly and hard on the equipment. And we can also end up with curtailment in hours where the storage capacity isn't enough to soak up the extra electricity generation. So all of these things add cost to the system, make the system less efficient to run. So that smoother renewable energy production is really helpful. And then the last piece I'll raise is when we do our modeling and we look at sort of like 10,000 different scenarios of possible future events that have a lot of uncertainty around them, so uncertainty around demand projections or fuel prices or renewable energy penetration, what we see is that interties consistently bring down production cost savings across a range of those uncertain events. So it helps to make our system more robust against these future uncertainties. So if transmission is important, the next question then becomes, well, how much of it should we really be building? And to look at this, we just did a little bit of modeling, actually. Madeline Seidel, who's probably here in the room somewhere, did this work, connecting 3 of our energy systems models, copper, which is a capacity expansion model, silver, our production cost model, and PRAS, which is NREL's resource adequacy model, to look at the benefits of specifically increasing interties between BC and Alberta and between Manitoba and Saskatchewan for a range of different scenarios around carbon price and clean electricity regulations. And what Maddie found is basically that the cost optimal expansion across BC Alberta is about 2,400 additional megawatts in addition to what's the existing intertie that's already there. And Manitoba, Saskatchewan is about 1,500 megawatts of additional capacity. But I think the more interesting piece than what those specific numbers are is actually where the benefits are coming from. So what Maddie found is that the production costs, emissions avoided, and capital cost savings, when you add all those up, we end up with a pretty modest cost-benefit ratio of about 1. It's not that compelling compared to the cost of actually expanding the intertie. It's really when we're looking at the reliability, resilience, and risk mitigation of the intertie where we see way bigger benefits. So cost-benefit ratios of 5 to 6. These are obviously for these specific provincial pairs. We would expect to see something different for different provincial pairs, but I think it's just really worth bearing in mind that a big part of the rationale around interties is also sort of the reliability, resilience benefits. So these results are consistent with other modeling efforts that have gone on over the years that really show that a substantial expansion of interties across the provinces brings reliability and resilience, especially in a decarbonized world. So then the question becomes, well, how can we do this? How can we build more transmission in Canada? Kate was sort of alluding to a lot of the challenges that we face with building interties. And so how do we overcome some of those challenges? So to look at this, I did a review of what the US, Australia, and Europe are doing as far as interregional transmission strategies. So this work is the culmination of about 200 interviews that I had with policymakers, modelers, utilities, in these jurisdictions over the last year or so. And the objective of this work was really to identify strategies and best practices for interregional transmission from these different jurisdictions to see if there were lessons that we could bring back to Canada. So the first thing I looked at was the political agenda. I think we know that if interties are not on the political agenda, they're not going to happen. And so the MOU between Alberta and Ottawa that mentioned interties is important there. Also the MOU between Ontario and Manitoba that was announced last week or the week before. We're starting to see interties coming onto the political agenda where they haven't actually really been in Canada for a long time. This is quite different than what I found in Europe and Australia, where interties have been on the political agenda and actually have been at the top of the political agenda, especially in the EU, for a number of years. The US is a little bit more complicated. It seems like it's a partisan divide there between Democrats and Republicans under the Biden administration, a lot of work going into intertie development, some new legislation that was brought in to push that forward that has sort of paused now. So it's a little bit more complicated in the US. The drivers for this political ambition is different across these different regions. In the Europe and the EU, it's really about renewable energy development. In the EU, really driven by decarbonization, but also a sense of solidarity and cooperation, which is really at the DNA of the EU mission. And in Australia, it's really about regional development and accessing renewable energy resources. And there was also a really big push for interties coming out of the 2016 blackout in South Australia, and a subsequent review that found that more interties really would help mitigate future blackouts. I'm putting sort of governance and planning together here because I think the key lesson for me looking across these different jurisdictions, especially the EU and Australia, was this combination of top-down and bottom-up, both governance and planning. So in both of these jurisdictions, it's, I would say, similar to Canada in that member countries in the EU still plan their own electricity systems. They have their own energy and climate policy. Same in Australia, the TNSPs in the Australian states plan their electricity systems, operate their electricity systems, but they are coordinated at that higher level. So there's coordination at the EU Commission level, and there's coordination at the Australia Energy Market Operator pulling these plans together. And I think it's really this combination of top-down and bottom-up governance and planning that are a key part of why these jurisdictions have been so much more successful in building interties. So that sort of leads us to the blueprint, where I think there's coming out of this international comparison work, really three key thrusts that seem to me critical if we want to enable intertie expansion in Canada. So this is in the CD Howe blueprint that was published about a month ago, and in these four phases, trying to advance those three thrusts forward. So the first thrust is really around coordinated planning. So this is interprovincial coordination, trying to stitch together the provincial plans into a more cohesive national strategy. And I just want to be really clear here, the proposal is not that we do away with provincial plans and instead have a single national strategy. That's not at all the proposal. Rather, the proposal is that we already have provincial plans, BC Hydro with their integrated resource plan, the IESO with their plan, etc. We have these plans that each of the provinces produce. The question is, how do we put those plans together so that they're stitched together into a more cohesive national plan? So we'll be starting to try to do some of that work in the new year. So that's one key piece. The second key piece is around having a really transparent and robust and consistent cost-benefit methodology. So the European Commission has their cost-benefit methodology. It's on version 4 now, where it really defines exactly what benefits are coming from the interties and which jurisdictions those benefits accrue to. And that's really important to be consistent and clear on how that distribution of benefits sort of lays out. And then that can inform a list of high priority projects that come out of that. So the European Commission, for example, has projects of common interest where projects that have gone through that cost-benefit analysis and have gone through this planning process are eligible for EU funding if they are designated as projects of common interest. And this, I think, would fit well with the new Major Projects Office in Ottawa if there was funding available from that office for projects that demonstrated a really high cost-benefit ratio. The second main thrust is around trading frameworks. So, of course, one of the barriers that we face in Canada is that each of the provinces has their own market. We don't have an internal energy market like Europe. We don't have a national energy market like Australia. And so that makes it difficult to trade between provinces. So what we need is a neutral trading interface that can implement a transparent trading platform. And again, it's important that the governance of this trading platform is really coming from the provincial regulators. Again, that this is something that is bottom up, really being driven by the provinces with federal coordination. And we don't have to start from scratch there. We can look to the Western US, where the Western Energy Imbalance Market and SPP's Market Plus have been working in recent years to enable trading between California's liberalized market and a lot of the vertically integrated utilities that are throughout the Western US. And then the third piece is really around financing models. And what struck me here looking at international examples was the diversity of funding sources that are going towards intertie development. So interties are not just being paid for out of the regulated rate base. That's part of it, and especially where interties improve the reliability of the system, there's a good case to be made there. But you also see renewable energy developers pooling resources to build interties, and other sort of diverse funding sources that I think are really important for making sure that there's access to capital to build these really expensive projects. I think the other key part of the financing model is that it's following a beneficiary pays cost-sharing structure. So again, going back to that cost-benefit analysis and being really clear on what the benefits are and which jurisdiction those benefits accrue to can help to come up with cost allocation models that share that or that distribute those costs according to who is benefiting the most. And again, that federal funding piece and Indigenous ownership piece, I think, are two important parts to consider with that as well. So in advancing all three of these thrusts, I think there's a few key principles. I think the first is really that it's led by the provinces and is really bottom up, both in the planning and the regulation. And the federal role is really one of coordination, not superseding the provinces, but coordinating, helping to coordinate the provinces. Independence in all three of those organizations, I think, is important. And then it maintains a perspective on iteration and innovation going forward. So these are the three pieces that have been published in the last little while. So the first one sort of on the modeling piece, the second one on the international review, and then the third one on the blueprint for Canada. Those are all out there, and happy to talk more about any of them in the question and answer. So thanks very much for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Madeline. Up next, we will hear from Saad Malik from NERC. So Saad is the manager of transmission assessments at NERC with over 24 years in the electric power industry, including senior roles at WECC and peak reliability. He has extensive experience in power system design, operations, and transmission planning, and recently led the U.S. Congress-mandated Interregional Transfer Capability Study. He holds a bachelor's in electrical engineering from the University of Engineering, Peshawar, a master's in electronic systems engineering from the University of Regina, and an MBA from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Welcome. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Kate, and good morning, everyone. Let me begin by asking you all a question. How many of you would like to see a big, beautiful transmission tower in your backyard? Oh, there are takers. All right, awesome. My job is done. So I want to talk to all of you after the presentation. So, most people did not raise their hands, right? And how about in your neighborhood? Maybe not a whole lot. Maybe one person over there. And there is another one, right? Let me ask the question a little differently, and maybe we'll get more hands raised. And that is to say that, what if I said that if you want to be reasonably assured that you're going to have power on a cold winter day like today, or in the dead heat of the summer, and in order to be reasonably assured about that, we need transmission and we need resources. How many of you would be okay with that? So now we get hands raised, right? So sometimes you have to ask the question a little bit differently. And this isn't an hypothetical that I'm talking about. The people in Texas became aware of that reality in winter of 2021, actually February of 2021, when a winter storm hit and people did not have power for 5 days. And that was catastrophic. Almost 300 people died. Following year, 2022, if you fast forward to December of 2022, there was a winter storm, Elliott, that hit southeastern U.S., central, east coast. Not as catastrophic, but yet had a huge impact on the system. A lot of demand was lost. So, so these are not hypotheticals. And then what happened in 2023 was that, as Kate mentioned, NERC was directed by United States Congress to perform a study. And the study asked us to look at what transmission exists between the regions, and then how much do we need more. Make recommendations of that. So I'm going to talk about that study, and then we did a subsequent study that focused on Canada. So the initial study was US-based, and then we did a follow-up that focused solely on Canada. But when we did the US study, we knew from the beginning that we cannot study the United States systems without including the Canadian systems into the model. That is integral, and vice versa, because our systems are so much joined at the hip, quite literally and figuratively. So I'll talk about that. So, extreme events is one thing, but if you look at the risk matrix, the resource mix is changing as we move forward. There are retirements in the picture. A lot of people talked about policy shift and reducing emissions. Demand growth. When we did the study, we knew about data centers coming, but boy, they came this year, roaring into the picture with AI infrastructure and the amount of demand that they are projecting. So all of these things are screaming at us. So this talks about, what our study entailed. As far as it was mandated by Congress, we were required to calculate transfer capability between each planning region. And then we were required to recommend additional transfer capability. And that was a bit of an uncomfortable area for us. We typically don't do that. We're not a system planner. NERC, if you don't know, we are regulators. And then we, enforce standards. We develop and enforce standards. But then beyond standards, we do these risk assessments. And then we highlight those risks for everybody. What was in scope? The biggest thing was that we wanted to create a model, North America-wide model, that had a common modeling approach. This is one of the things that we see when different regions model the system. Everybody models it based on their own preferences. So it was really, really critical for us that when we make a model for the system, we're using a common modeling approach, and we're measuring each system with a common yardstick. Extreme weather, I talked about that. Additional transfer capability recommendations, we had to do that. We are an independent organization. As a regulator, we are required to be independent, but that doesn't mean that we work in isolation. So industry was very heavily involved in all of our analyses and work that we did with this study. And our pure focus is reliability. That's the only thing we look at. We are not looking at cost. We're not looking at policy. We look at these things to the extent that they impact reliability, but nothing beyond that. We did not look at, any specified projects that were out there. We don't endorse any projects. We're an independent organization, so purely looking at reliability lens. So what did we learn from all of this? Transfer capability varies throughout the year when you look at interregional transfer capability. It's not realistic to say that there's a single number that you can represent transfer capability between two regions, because it varies quite a bit. The observed transfer capabilities were actually higher between Canada and US compared to between the provinces. I mean, that's an obvious thing for many people that are involved in planning. We found that the Canadian systems are becoming increasingly vulnerable to extreme weather. So as we studied the current system, and then we studied the 10-year out system, we saw that the vulnerability is increasing. And then, additional transfer capability was beneficial for many regions. I mean, you can see that, throughout Canada, many regions we found would benefit from additional transfer capability. Policy has a huge impact on where it plays or how it plays out in the future. If there's more retirements, the energy deficiencies could increase. And so the policy shift has to be carefully managed. The hammer that we were required to use by the legislation was transmission. But we have mentioned this in the report extensively, and again we say that a more comprehensive approach is really, really important. That a combination of transmission, resources, demand-side management, storage, all of these tools have to be used. And somebody talked about energy efficiency in the beginning. So all of these tools are really, really important in ensuring a reliable electric system. So how did we do that? I'll talk a little bit about modeling. So we modeled the entirety of the North American system into a production cost model. And the first thing we did was that we divided the whole system into individual regions, and we calculated transfer capabilities between those regions. And those transfer capabilities were the existing, current transfer capabilities. And then we modeled the 10-year out demand and resource forecast. And then we evaluated how the current transfer capabilities would pose limitations to energy adequacy in the future. So how did we do that? So we looked at weather. We used the weather as a primary, input tool to forecast the demand profiles, resources, all of that. We could go only 5 years into the history for actual data, and people talked about data, today as well. I think that's really key. So the actual data that we had was only 5 years worth of data. Before that, we could not get a whole lot of good real data. We had to generate synthetic data. And actually, we didn't generate it. We used a lot of the data that was already generated by NREL. We tweaked it for our purposes. So the idea here is that we're not studying the history. We are studying the historic weather, how it plays out 10 years into the future. So that's really what we're doing here. And the idea is to capture those, extreme events like the 2009 Quebec event, Western area heat domes, the other events that I talked about. So the way we do that is then those 12 weather years are then represented for each hour. So that's, 87, 60, hours of each of the 12 weather years, and each of the region is modeled with correlated availability of wind and solar, hydro capacity, seasonal hydro capacity, thermal resource availability, outages, storage, and demand. And that gives us, for in each hour, we know which region it has energy surplus, which region is in deficit. And that gave us, the information that we were looking for is that the regions that are in deficit, which of their neighbors had energy surplus, so that then we can, and then they had surplus, and yet their transmission was constrained. So those were the ties that we prioritized for recommendation of additional transfer capability. Makes sense, right? So this is it was a 6-step process. We, did not add all the transfer. I think the key thing here, this is a novel process. This was the first time that we did this. And there was a lot that we learned as part of the process. And one of the things was that when we found energy deficiency in a region, we did not just took one step and allocated all of that additional transfer capability to all the neighbors that had energy available. It was a step process. And that's because there is a really intricate interplay between transmission and storage, and then also importing, and not only importing energy from the neighbor, but the neighbor's neighbor may have energy available. So suddenly when you increase transfer capability to your neighbor, now your neighbor's neighbor can supply energy to you as well. So that's one of the key things that we learned as well as part of the process as we did this work. Oh, I went back. Didn't want to do that. So these are our results in a picture. So the actual numbers don't matter as much. The colored regions are the ones where we found deficiency. And then the lines that are colored as well, those are the lines where additional transfer capability would help. Across the board, we looked at all the neighbors, right? So whether they were on the north side of the border or the south side of the border. And you can see that there are benefits all across. So it doesn't really matter, whether it was a benefit from, additional energy available from the Canadian side or the U.S. side. There's across the board benefit. And then you can see that there are two, hopefully you can see that, the two dotted orange lines, that one of them goes from Saskatchewan to MISO West, and then there's another one from Ontario to PJM East. Those ties do not exist. So these were the hypotheticals that we studied, and then we found that there was significant reliability benefit in those ties if they were to be developed. So at the end, what did we learn? At a high level, interregional transfers are critical under extreme weather, and they are becoming increasingly important going forward. I mentioned the interplay between transmission and storage. And for those of you who are interested, you can read our report. It's on our website, NERC.com. And then we talk a lot about that, how that transmission and storage interplay happens. And data, data is really, really important. I love this open source data and models that's here. I think that's really critical. That was a challenge that we had to overcome because a lot of data was not available as readily as we would like to see. So, those people, that are in the data and can make data available to everybody. It's not just, to the entities that are working with you, but for researchers, universities, other organizations that are doing these studies, they need data. Without that, they won't be able to, do their jobs, and it benefits everybody. And, we, like I mentioned, that Canada leans a lot more north to south versus east to west. And that's just how organically the grid has evolved. And, finally, look beyond your planning area. Look at all the neighbors. That's really, really important. Having plans that are integrated between transmission and resources. Historically, resource planning and transmission planning happened in silos. So the big learning here is that the transmission and the resources should be planned simultaneously, like together as a system. And then look beyond your geographic boundaries and other neighbors as well. So I guess that's my last slide. So thank you very much. Let's get some transmission built, because it's not about just keeping the lights on, but it's about saving lives.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Saad. Up next, we have Muhammad Al-Kathari from Net Zero Atlantic. Muhammad is an energy system modeler at Net Zero Atlantic, leading work on Atlantic Canada energy system models to assess clean energy transmission and electrification pathways for Atlantic Canada. Muhammad works closely with government, utilities, and academic partners to evaluate net zero scenarios and develop evidence-based insights for Atlantic Canada's energy transition. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Hello, everyone. I would like to talk about two main things: why transmission is important and why a coordinated planning is important. Echo what Madeleine said and Saad said, but only from an Atlantic perspective. So before jump into the Atlantic perspective of that, a little introduction about who we are. We are an independent, non-profit organization based in Halifax. We serve the 4 Atlantic provinces. We are leading applied research that advance Atlantic Canada towards carbon neutral future. Who we are a professional engineers, scientists, modelers, supported by expert in professional services, finance, operation, communication, and engagement. So now let's take a look and find out why Atlantic Canada energy system is unique and why it has special challenges. Atlantic Canada is a winter peaking area, so with more goals towards electrification, that winter peak will get worse and worse. We are 4 small provinces that's largely independent, so we have a limited coordination between each other, and we have a limited connectivity. We have on top of that a decarbonization targets that we need to meet, and at the same time we have the challenge of aging thermal assets that need to be replaced soon. We have a world-class offshore wind resources that can provide for that demand and for that electrification, and can position Atlantic Canada as an exporter for electricity. But of course, that enabler need to be there. We need to coordinate together to enable that kind of export potential. Now let's look into a project that we have carried out in Net Zero Atlantic that look into these challenges and put the first step into the coordinated planning. So it's a first of its kind project that is funded by NRCan, an energy innovation program. And why it's first of its kind? Because it's looked into the region as a whole Atlantic Canada, and it involves the 4 Atlantic provincial government, 2-3 Atlantic electrical utilities, and we have observers from outside, from US Department of Energy, Independent System Operator of New England, Hydro-Quebec, and NRCan, and the project is executed by a partnership between Stantec and E3. The project have 3 phases. The first one is where electricity goes. The second one is identify the resources and how much we can build offshore wind. And the third one is how we can transfer and move that electricity. So now let's take a look into the modeling framework. This project involved extensive amount of modeling, starting from long-term planning modeling, capacity expansion model, and then production cost model, that is like a medium-term model, and then a very short-term model which goes to minutes and seconds, which looking into the power flow model. But the most important thing about this project is the stakeholder engagement doesn't happen in between all of that. So we always wanted all the 4 government to be involved in refining the assumption and refining the scenario, so everyone agreed upon the scenario that had been designed. Of course, it's hard to bring all of them into agreement, but at least they know what is happening in this project. And this is the result for the first phase of the project. As we can see here, there is a lot of information there. You can download the report from our website. But what I want to highlight here is that the main key takeaway from that first phase report is that there is a significant potential for offshore wind in Atlantic Canada. There's a large export potential. The transmission is the key. And I want to echo what my other colleagues say, that transmission is a key, is an enabler for that export. And of course, it will minimize the curtailment and also will enhance reliability. But the big question mark is how much we need to build out. And this is another exercise that we have carried out internally using our model. We have a capacity expansion model that we have developed internally to run our work. And what we have done there, we said, okay, let's now say we will define an external electricity demand. We want to see what will happen within the Atlantic Canada energy system, how much transmission we need to expand, and how much offshore wind we need when we define that external electricity demand. The numbers here are not very important. The main key takeaway from this one is to say that if Atlantic Canada want to play a significant role in exporting electricity towards outside Atlantic Canada, we need to have a coordinated electricity system planning, and we need to expand our transmission lines. That's very clear from this analysis. Now let's look into a real case where it shows the importance of the transmission lines and why the transmission lines are important even without an offshore wind playing a role there. So in 2023, there was a cold spill in the Atlantic Canada, and PEI, their load demand because of the heating raised up 22% more than the recorded one. And at that time, the island relied almost 90% for their electricity from their neighboring New Brunswick. So they only avoided the load shed by few megawatt. And what that tells us, that these kind of incidents highlight the risk of building a wind-dominant system without a strong ties to their neighbors. Now let's look into how the coordinated planning playing a role there. If we see at that time, Quebec announced emergency, so they say we will not export electricity to New Brunswick. So they purchase their electricity from New England. At the same time, at the same hours, New Brunswick also purchased their electricity from New England, but they have a commitment to provide some of that electricity to PEI. But the good thing is that Newfoundland, that time, they didn't have that very low temperature, so they have an excess of energy that they can support. So that electricity were moved on from New Brunswick through Maritime Link and then exported through Nova Scotia to PEI. And that shows us that the coordinated planning is very important. Now let's take a look into a methodology that shows if we want to look further beyond our neighbors, what kind of metric we can look at to show us how we are we good together to provide electricity to each other or not. So the daily minimum margin, this graph is taken from the Energy System Integrated Group, and it shows how often two regions have their lowest energy supply at the same time. So which means that when the correlation is high, means that they cannot provide each other electricity during the peak hours, but they can, of course, provide electricity during surplus of time. However, when that correlation is low or negative, means that two regions can support each other. So I think for Canada, we need to have something like that to start with. And yeah, and the main key takeaway from this presentation, I don't want to echo and reply what my other colleagues say about the importance of the transmission lines. Transmission lines is a key, is very important. But I want to say that if we remember the Atlantic Loop at that time, there was a lot of talk, a lot of push towards the Atlantic Loop, but for some reason, politics say, no, that's not going to happen. What we are recommending here, or we're suggesting like a bigger loop that is bi-directional, that include Atlantic Canada, Quebec, Ontario, US, and we need to understand how that will work, but that, of course, will require a lot of coordination and public and political support. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Finally, but certainly not least, I'm pleased to welcome Kwatuma Cole-Sayers to come to the podium for his presentation, Turning Transmission on its Head. Kwatuma Cole-Sayers is a member of the Hupakasa Nation and executive director of the Clean Energy Association of BC. He applies the principles of Hisimlua and ISAC to guide First Nations-led clean energy projects, advance reconciliation, and support BC's transition to low-carbon energy. He is also an expert panel member for the Climate Institute, advocating for innovative policies and sustainable economic growth.
Great.
Thank you.
Kate, and great job at those words. I know it's very challenging with many different languages, especially New Tonal. But yes, Hishimtua is something that guides my work, working together, and I think that speaks perfectly to the work that I'm going to be explaining to you. But before I begin, I want to acknowledge the Algonquin people. I want to acknowledge their land here, and I'm very grateful to be here. And I'm happy to be here with all of you. It's really exciting. Even though I'm running on a few hours of sleep, I feel really energized being around here, being in this room. This is certainly a lot of important topics and a lot of smart people in this room. So I'm excited to learn about all the work that you're doing and my fellow esteemed panelists. So who am I? My name is Kwatuma Cole-Sayers. I am largely based in BC. My nation is on Vancouver Island, and we're one of the first majority-owned clean energy projects in Canada. I have been the executive director of Clean Energy BC, which is an industry association that represents the renewable sector as well as over 60 BC First Nations, as well as advising the BC First Nations political bodies. I was co-author on a report, and I work with the Clean Climate Institute. But today, I want to talk about the bottom two. I co-founded a non-for-profit called the Indigenous Power Coalition, and I will be moving over to a new exciting initiative, the Western Transmission Catalyst. And now we're talking about transmission, and Mohammed had mentioned about transmission. How do we get it built? They've explained the case for why the benefits, and I know everyone here knows the benefits of it, but how do we get it built? Linear infrastructure is already very significantly challenging, but then throw in more provinces, utilities, grid operators, First Nations, private property owners. It's a very unique challenge, but we believe that we have some solutions that we want to bring forward. But first, what is the Indigenous Power Coalition? The Indigenous Power Coalition is essentially has one goal, and that's to center Indigenous leadership. Any sort of infrastructure that's going to be built has to have Indigenous equity participation, but not only that, our model wants to center Indigenous nations as being the proponent and being the lead as they enter into negotiations to partner with the relevant utilities and working with the relevant grid operators and governments. This approach positions First Nations-led transmission projects from the historical Indigenous inclusion to one that's going to center Indigenous leadership. the Western Transmission Catalyst is part of the Indigenous Power Coalition. We have a number of great folks involved in this, Blake Schaefer and Madeline McPherson, the Transition Accelerator, Dunsky, Phil Dunsky, and I can't recall the full name of his shop, but they're a partner, Dunsky Advisors, or just Dunsky. I don't know, most probably everyone knows him here, as well as the First Nations Major Products Coalition, the University of Calgary, and if I'm forgetting any of them, I'm sorry. But we have a number of people who all believe in this one goal, and that's to center Indigenous leadership. I think what's been lacking in these conversations is lack of coordination, which has been explained, but also a lack of our limited Indigenous participation. So we believe that we're coming to this problem that's generally international, but here in Canada, it's domestic with a number of provinces. We believe that we can be a convener as well as bringing in the nation, so we can center Indigenous leadership to act as the proponent, and often in these cases. So the IPAC's leadership role in creating the conditions for success are there, and we're excited to get to work. So I'm not going to explain this slide because my panelists have covered this very well, so I'll just say ditto. Good job. And with the IPC, there's an important shift that I had mentioned previously from a historical inclusion. This is the traditional IBAs or consultation. We're going to check a box. Here's the set of conditions that we're going to offer you, and that's it. We want to change that. We're now moving into an era of reconciliation and economic reconciliation, and for us, that means Indigenous leadership and true partnerships. We are seeing that, but it takes work, and it takes Indigenous leadership to be at the table. And in this regard, we need more First Nations at all planning stages with respect to utilities, not just the internal planning, but also now the interregional planning. And that's something that we hope to do with our partners. And the other advantage of this IPP proponent-led model, this is a new and exciting phenomenon in Canada where First Nations we're now the proponents. In the 2024 Call for Power in BC, 9 of the 10 of those projects are 51% owned by the nations. So we are now majority owners. We are now the proponents. So we now have to start thinking about these are our projects. We have to show up, and we are responsible to consult and engage, and we have to do that properly. And that's why it's important to have the Indigenous leadership there, so we can get it right. And there are also a number of other benefits that I will get into. And so that's where the Indigenous Power Coalition is coming in. We are well supported. We want to support the nations and across Western Canada in a number of ways. But first, some of the key principles that are that base our work are equity ownership, jurisdiction and decision-making authority, and environmental stewardship, and proactive project design. Some of these things are high level, but when you start getting into actually building projects, it's essential to have nations feeding input into potential routes, because routing is one of the biggest questions that folks have with linear infrastructures. Where's your project going to go? How is it going to impact the land? And so when you have nations who know the territories leading that work, you're going to have a much better project. And that's not to mention the regulatory expediency that's going to come from that. And with I won't get to that right now, but there are a number of benefits as First Nations leading these projects. And I really wanted pictures and less words. We had some number of workshops with First Nations. We wanted to center Indigenous leadership, and basically, who has built transmission by First Nations for First Nations. And two of these women here, our friend Gus Gasanaway Sky Deer from Ganawage, so close to here. She is partnering with Hydro-Quebec on the Hertel line. And her story is great. I love it. You know, her families have built the skyline of Manhattan, and now they're going to help keep the lights on in Manhattan. So it's a beautiful story. And Margaret, she's the CEO of Waite Power. They have connected previously diesel-generated reliant communities in northwestern Ontario, and they have built a line connecting, I think 25 nations are involved in that. So very significant and similar in size and scope to what we're looking at across Canada between BC, Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Saskatchewan, Alberta. And we had the opportunity for those leaders to share how they got those projects built, how they got all those nations together, because it's very significant once you start getting into the details around revenue allocations, project governance, etc. And so these higher level objectives around certainty and stability are key for these types of projects. And that's a number of the questions that we got from the nations around, particularly around the regulatory environment. Something around Indigenously intertie would require a lot of changes to the regulatory environment. So we certainly want to get the nations to begin thinking around how as a consortium of nations can not only build the line, but also provide some regulatory certainty by being proactive and saying this is what needs to change, or going to governments and saying, look, we exist, we're ready to partner, and we need to make the requisite regulatory policy and legislative changes to make it happen. There is precedence. The North Coast Transmission Line, they recently changed the BC Hydro Act to enable Indigenous ownership, because previously Indigenous owners couldn't own transmission in British Columbia. So there is precedence. So we are moving slowly to this era where we can allow and enable First Nations ownership of this critical infrastructure. And if we have nations leading it, it's only going to provide increased certainty for a critical piece of infrastructure that, thanks to these folks, that we know that we need. And there's a whole host of benefits that also they covered. And that's pretty much it. And conclusion, for First Nations leadership is the foundation for sustainable and successful projects. The research on clean energy projects in Canada demonstrates that these projects with significant First Nations participation, governance, financial interest lead to better project outcomes. And the IPC model, that is First Nations acting as proponent, is the way forward for building linear infrastructure so that we can be proactive, and that's going to be something that we can all be proud of. That when we're talking about nation-building projects, it's actually being built by the First Nations in partnership with Canadians, with British Columbians, Albertans, Saskatchewanites, what is that? I don't even know. But it's people in Saskatchewan, Manitoba. So it's very exciting, and we are relatively new initiative, but very timely. We're seeing interties in the news, and I think we have to strike while the iron's hot, and we believe that we have a solid team, and we're very excited to get to work. And this is a bit of a soft launch. I am slowly transitioning into this role to help this collective to work with the nations in the 4 Western provinces, in the utilities and grid operators. So we're looking forward to that. So thank you for listening. I think lunch is pretty close, so I know you're getting hungry. So I am ending short. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much to all the presenters for their thoughtful and insightful presentations. It's very clear that, just as Cole said, it's very clear interties are beneficial, and we have questions on the Slido, but we also have questions in the room. So maybe I'll take one from Slido first, and then I see someone has a question at the mic. So for Madeline, when analyzing the integrated operation of BC and Alberta, that intertie, how did you model the nuances of the different structures of those systems? So BC being vertically integrated and Alberta being market-based.
So in that modeling work, it didn't really take into account the market structures at all. That was just a dispatch optimization of, so there weren't any market principles in there. It's just more of like a resource question. So, when the wind is strong in Alberta, it can flow into BC, and then when the wind drops off in Alberta, the hydro can flow back. And so it was more about the cost optimization on the infrastructure side. So how much more wind can you develop, low cost wind can you develop in Alberta when you have an intertie that's connected to the battery that is BC. So yeah, no markets in there.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Daniel Rosenblum, Ivy Research Chair in Sustainability Transitions here at Carleton University. My question's for Sad, but also for the other panelists. And I really like your questions at the beginning. Thanks for having us kind of address our biases. I like that. So when we're looking at the existing transmission setup, and as you put it, the north-south circumstances that have evolved over the last century, essentially. We're now faced with this kind of new reality, the cleavages that have started to emerge with respect to Canada and the US. And I'm wondering whether or not, in terms of your risk assessments, in terms of how you're envisioning the transmission systems starting to evolve over the course of the next series of decades, and recognizing that it's a gradual process, not one where we're seeing kind of like maybe Doug Ford saying, okay, well, we want to shut off the power. There might be some serious technical limitations to doing something like that, but that there could be a gradual re-emphasis on east-west connections, as Madeline was putting that out there. To what extent have you started that kind of risk assessment process, and what are you seeing in relation to that rebalancing, perhaps along more of an east-west line? It's not thinking just about like the optimal flows, but rather the kind of real political and geopolitical realities.
No, I knew that was coming. So I guess what I would say to that, a few things that come to mind. If you look at the life of a transmission circuit, say 500 kV circuit, right? It's a minimum 30 years, 40 years. How many election cycles is that, right? So you really want to think, when you're thinking of this large interregional projects, you really want to think long term. And there's a reason over the last 100 years you've said that how the grid has evolved and to a point where there's about 12 to 16 gigawatt of transfer capability that exists between the United States and Canada. That's not a small number. So there's an organic reason that happened. One of the benefits that I have is that because I'm NERC, so we don't have to talk about policy too much. so I can stay clear of that, and purely from a reliability perspective, that opening of the ties, that's going to be bad for both the United States and Canada. I can say that. And we've done the analysis, and we see no benefit in that in terms of reliability when it comes to reliability. So that's going to be catastrophic because the system is not designed that way. System is not operated that way. Now, what are we seeing for the future? So we see Champlain Hudson being built right now. We are seeing, I forgot the name of the DC tie that goes from New England to Hydro-Quebec. Yeah, that's the other one major DC tie being built. So, and then, the undertones from the real, policy driver from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that regulates the energy in the United States. If you look at FERC Order 1920, I would highly recommend everybody looking at that. That goes into a lot of what Madeline was talking about, where she showed that the 1.0 benefit to cost ratio goes to like 4 or 5 when you look at the multidimensional transmission benefits. So that's our requirement going forward for all U.S. Transmission planning regions to do number one, look 20 years out. That's number one. Number two, look at all the benefits that come from transmission and then make decisions. So that's kind of what messaging that I want to everybody to think about and reframe that in the larger context.
I'm glad that you're optimistic that it's a one-term kind of circumstance that we're facing, but I'm concerned that the fracture that we've experienced is one that will have echoes over time. But thank you very much for your response. I agree that this is not going to be an overnight thing. It's a gradual process.
Fantastic. Okay. I'm going to ask a question from Slido, and this one is for Cole. When non-Indigenous speak of First Nations, they often describe them as one homogenous voice, which is definitely not the reality. So how do you deal with the differing views, needs, wants of many First Nations involved in potential coalitions along interprovincial lines?
Yeah. Hello. Hi. That's a great question, and it is a challenge because once you start working with not even just 20, but even 2, it's a challenge. And the legal landscape is also different in Treaty 8 from the BC and Alberta side, and there are also then Métis settlements who are also on Alberta side. So there's very different considerations for each region and each nations. So I won't sugarcoat it. It is a very challenging thing. But for big projects like that, that's just what you have to confront. And the best thing to do is just get all the nations together and start talking about what the opportunity is and to show them what the project is, what the overall objective is, and seeing what role that plays in the bigger picture. And when you do that, all the other issues can kind of fall in place and they can be worked through. There's a way to work through those challenges, and we are seeing that, especially when you start early. You start often, and you have those relationships and you maintain those relationships. I think we have a lot of examples that where maybe the industry proponent didn't do that, and it was much more contentious. But I think with nations supporting nations, there's a different energy that comes with being proactive and nations working together. And the Waiite Power is a great example of nations who directly benefited from the line or had the lines through the territories, and some nations who didn't. But they're also bringing them in just to help provide that certainty to get the line built.
Fantastic. Thanks. We have a question up here.
Thanks. Michael Wallenitz from Navius Research. My question is for Madeline. So we already have an existing transmission line between British Columbia and Alberta, but it's significantly derated, so you can't move as much electricity through it as theoretically could be technically possible. So if there are all of these significant benefits, why hasn't that happened yet? Why haven't we, at the very least, upgraded the existing connection between BC and Alberta? What's the sticking point?
Yeah, and I think there's sort of 2 answers to that question. There's sort of the technical answer to that question, which is where that intertie comes in is also where a lot of wind comes in. And so it becomes the biggest reliability contingency for the AESO to manage. So that line is rated at between 1,000 and 1,200 megawatts, depending on the flow of power. If it was flowing all of that power at a given moment in time and something were to happen to that intertie, if it were to go down, Alberta would have to have enough reserves on hand to be able to, keep the grid going, keep the grid. And that capacity within the AESO is not there. That's been known on the grid side, like the capacity on the grid's not there. That's been known for a really long time, and the AESO has a directive to fix that issue. TBD. Although I think they are working on it. So that's kind of like the technical answer to that question. The political answer to that question is that flowing more power from BC to Alberta would depress prices in Alberta, which would be great for consumers in Alberta, but would be not so great for the profit-seeking generators in Alberta. It's an unbundled market, so lower power system prices. Yeah, so good for consumers, not so good for producers. So there was some investigative journalism that went on that leaked communication between the between the government of Alberta and the AESO, basically to not good for producers.
Protect the producers.
Yeah. So and then there's the Alberta perspective also, which is that they can't flow power through the BC system down into the States because PowerX holds all of those firm rights on all of those transmission lines. So I think there's a perspective also from Alberta that it's not, they don't really get the benefit of being able to export power through BC down the West Coast into California and where prices are higher. So I think there's definitely a trading framework that has to get figured out between the provinces to make all of this fair and to ensure that benefits are being distributed in a fair way. And I think getting that intertie up and running and having a fair trading framework, I mean, the provinces, those two provinces are talking about it. Now it's been under discussion for a while now, but yeah, I think getting that intertie back up and running is obviously a logical thing to do.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, we have 2 minutes till 12:30. I will ask, and this is a general question to any presenter/panelist. To what degree does intertie benefit modeling take into account climate change trends in both temperature and precipitation variability? Anyone?
I can start with that. That's an interesting question. Yeah. Right now, the models doesn't take into account if they mean like if the temperature impact on the transmission line itself, it's not there. It's not accounted for. But what is accounted for is for long-term carbon capturing and net zero targets that have been accounted for the local energy system within each region. But for that, there's now a lot of research and investigation about changing how the rate of the transmission line can change with temperature, and how we can maintain that to transfer more electricity. And when is the time to, because it's very hot outside, we can transfer that amount of electricity.
And I can just jump in quickly. So the results we were looking at today don't take really any extreme weather event, just historical, what we've seen so far. But we are actually starting a project in the new year with some partners to look specifically at extreme weather events and kind of design extreme weather events scenarios. So kind of like looking back historically at historical extreme weather events where certain things sort of pile up. Doing sort of a similar thing, deliberately stressing the system in certain ways. So we'll be working on that in the new year.
Did you want to add anything, Saad?
Yeah, that was really what we were trying to do as well, is that the value of transmission comes from those types of extreme events. So we did, look at that both from primarily from an energy perspective, because those extreme events impact not only your demand is going up, and then your resources may not be available. So that's really where the value of transmission comes, because then you can see where you have the uncorrelated, systems that can meet the demand in those conditions. So.
Thank you so much. We have a question at the front here.
Hello, Franziska Ferg, also from Navius Research. Thanks again for all the presentations. I'm really interested, I think it's mostly a question for you, Saad, about you spoke to the role of, the relationship between storage and interties. So I was just curious if also in other modeling, if you've looked at that and if you found those two pathways to be in competition or also found complementary relationship between the two. And yeah, just curious to hear a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. I would highly recommend reading our report. That was one of the key findings that we that were in our study. So what happens is that, let's say you have a deficit in a system, and that deficit a lot of the times is happening when the sun is going down, when you know, especially for the solar heavy systems. So now, you know, your transmission is constrained, and you're trying to meet that demand from storage, for example, right? If you add a little bit of transmission, what you can do is that meet that demand during the day. So keep your storage charged, don't use it, and then use it at the sundown hours. So with a little bit of transmission added to the system, now you are taking advantage of the interplay between transmission and storage. So they go hand in hand. They work really well with each other. So that's one of the key findings. That was one of the reasons why we wanted to do a step increase of transfer capability, because we wanted to see that interplay between transmission and storage. And that was a huge benefit that we saw. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Great question. Okay, this is a question for Mohammed. To what extent is tidal energy being explored in Atlantic Canada, and why does offshore wind always seem to be a more prevalent technology?
That's a very interesting question. Nova Scotia have tried a tidal generator, I think a few years ago, and it found out that the maintenance for that generators is taking a lot of expenses. So they just abandoned it, and from that time on, the tidal energy was not an optimal solution in all our modeling. Like it's expensive comparing to offshore, and the resources for offshore wind in the Atlantic Canada is abundant. It's world class. That's why the politician in Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada going forward with the offshore wind, and it's proven to be something that can provide electricity to Atlantic Canada and even beyond. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Yes. Oh, yes, there's questions. There's questions everywhere. I just have to look up.
Both, because I'll defer.
Whoever went first.
Okay, I'll
Fantastic.
as long as only gets a question too. Mostly for Madeline, but for the rest of the panel too. I mean, I'm afraid you've invited a question of comparative public policy and governance, which is why have the United States, Australia, the European Union all been able to establish institutional structures for coordination of precisely this sort of interjurisdictional transfers of electricity, and Canada has been completely unable to do so. If you ask the Canadian Energy Regulator a question about this, they dive under the table. So I'm curious, do we have, it was the obvious question, particularly from Madeline's analysis, why is Canada the outlier among these federal and quasi-federal systems?
Yeah, I think kind of so in having a lot of these discussions, one of the first things you hear when you talk about interprovincial transmission in Canada is it'll never happen because the provinces will never give up jurisdiction over their power systems. It's like, I can't tell you how many times I heard that sentiment in the discussions that I was having with Canadians. And I think the point that's a little bit missing in that idea is that the European Union and Australia have not given up, like countries within Europe and states within Australia have not given up control over their power systems to the European Commission or the federal government in Australia. And I think that's a little bit the misconception. Provinces don't have to give up jurisdiction over the power systems to coordinate. And I think jumping immediately to that conclusion that provinces would have to give up jurisdiction over their power system in order to coordinate is one of the hang-ups, not the only hang-up, but one of the main hang-ups that we've been having. And so I think that distinction between those two things, provinces maintaining control of not just the power system, but also energy policy, electricity policy, climate policy, regional development, et cetera, that can stay at the provincial level while there is coordination between the provinces. And I think missing that point and assuming that coordination would mean provinces ceding that control to the federal government is not true and has been a big barrier.
Great, thank you.
I'm so glad you were able to say that so diplomatically. Great. I'm Phil Duguay. I'm an independent consultant. My question's for Saad. So let's just say that like everything that we all want happens, and there's like massive interregional planning processes, there's tons of capital, there's competition, there's ideas coming out, and okay, wow, all the constructors are getting involved, OEMs are all crowding in, and then boom, we start building lines, like 1, 2, 3, big transmission lines. So the Northeast States Collaborative in the US has this big process going on. And if you read through the details, Brattle did the report, it says that they want to build 10 gigawatts of new capacity with Eastern Canada by 2050. Like, we should have started 5 years ago with the rate that we build stuff. So what kind of tools does NPCC or NERC need to actually like guide this from a reliability perspective? Because the system impact studies take a really long time. All the kind of NPCC processes take a long time. So like if Santa was coming to your house, like what do you want? Like what do you want in your stocking for Christmas? Thanks.
All right. Yeah, that's a really, really good question and a tough one to answer as well. I think, you know, from an overall policy perspective, and by the way, you know, the report that we did was filed with FERC last year, and now FERC has a clock that's ticking for February of 2026, where they have to submit their report to Congress as well. So that process is ongoing. But from a policy perspective, you know, one thing that I would say is that really, really important to think that transmission is one piece of the puzzle. We need to think broadly, you know, and it's you know, this is more of a cliche that, you know, don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? So, you know, building a lot of long, you know, transmission also has, you know, risks associated with that. So, you know, Madeline was talking about challenges that Alberta has to deal with, because now they have, you know, if they lose that single contingency, they have to have enough reserves to be able to manage that. So there are challenges with that. So there has to be depending on each, so speaking specifically from a Canadian perspective, each province's situation is unique. And everybody should look at what is the best set of tools, including transmission, including resources, including demand response, including storage, including energy efficiency, all of these things put together, what is the best solution. As far as, you know, steps, I would say that, you know, coordinated transmission and resource planning is really, really critical. That's number one. Number two is this wide area planning, that looking beyond jurisdiction. You're not going to find benefit if you don't look. So that's the challenge that's, you know, I think a lot of systems are facing today, because we're not looking, we're not going to find benefit. So that's, you know, at least at a high level. I mean, we cannot, per the Federal Power Act, we cannot direct building transmission. We cannot direct building resources. We're not allowed to do that by the law. So the only thing we look at is you know, what are the reliability risks that are coming, and there's plenty. So there's a, you know, big case to be built around the need for energy adequacy going forward, and you know, transmission plays a key role, but then looking at it more holistically as well. Hopefully I answered your question somewhat.
All the tools you need for a major build-out.
What are the tools that we...
Do you have all the tools?
Do I? Oh, you know, so that's not our role, right? We cannot build transmission. So NERC...
To supervise reliability if all of a sudden there's 10,000 megawatts of new...
So so those decisions involve more than just reliability, right? Reliability is really, really important, so that should be the top. But then there is economics that come into picture. There is policy that comes into picture. So whenever you're making decisions, there is routing, siting and permitting that, Cole was talking about. That's really, really critical for the indigenous nations. So there's a lot more that goes into it than reliability. So I think our lens is reliability lens, so we're looking from that perspective. But then when the entities that are planning the system and their regulators should look at a broader set of objectives and then make the choice accordingly, is what I would say.
Okay, don't have time for one more question. Folks who are still in the room, the panel, the presenters, I'm sure, will be here during lunch, and you can ask them your question. Before we leave for lunch, want to please join me in thanking our presenters for session 2.